she whispered. "It hurts when I sit." The town looked away, but one man believed her. The town of Bell's Hollow woke slow and dusty under the faded gold of a New Mexico morning. Church bells hadn't rung yet, but the scent of cornbread and heat hung in the air like a curtain of silence. At the edge of the chapel's courtyard, Mary Ann stood with her arms full of heavy kitchen pots, her frame small beneath the weight. She was 19, but she moved like someone twice her age, careful, quiet, avoiding sudden steps like they might betray her. Inside the church kitchen, the preacher's wife barked orders while wiping flour from her apron. The women preparing Sunday supper were loud and quick with judgment, but Mary Ann moved around them like a ghost, saying nothing, touching nothing more than she had to. When she crouched to stack firewood near the stove, she winced. Barely a breath, barely a sound, but it was enough. One of the older women, Sister Darlene, paused as she passed behind her. "Why you moving like a colt with a sore leg, child?" Mary Ann stood up slowly. Her voice was dry when it came. "It hurts when I sit." Just that. A whisper. The room stilled for a heartbeat. Then Sister Darlene gave a tight smile, too polite to be kind. "Well, maybe if you didn't slouch so much," she said, and walked on. The other women went back to their chatter. No one asked what she meant. No one wanted to know. Mary Ann returned to scrubbing the stone steps behind the chapel where she could breathe without watching eyes. Her wrists were raw, and the hem of her dress was soaked through. She sat just for a moment on the edge of the bottom step. When her hips touched the stone, she flinched hard and bit her lip to keep from crying out. A breeze stirred the dust behind her. She thought she was alone until she heard the clink of a horseshoe striking stone. Across the road, under the shadow of the blacksmith's awning, a man leaned against the post, broad-shouldered, silent, watching. His face was hard-carved by time and smoke, with a beard peppered in gray, and eyes so still they seemed to study without blinking. Caleb Rye. The townsfolk called him a drifter, a loner, a man who stopped talking the day his wife and daughter died and hadn't wasted breath since. Mary Ann met his gaze only for a second. Then she stood, brushed her skirt, and disappeared around the corner. That night during evening service, she sat at the back of the chapel alone. Every wooden pew was polished smooth, with years of bodies pressing into them. But the moment she lowered herself, a sharp gasp escaped her lips. Not loud, but loud enough. A few heads turned. The preacher paused. Then he smiled wide and spoke louder, drowning her in the rhythm of his voice. Mary Ann looked down at her hands folded in her lap, trembling slightly. On her knuckles were thin marks like faded rope burns. She glanced toward the exit, and just outside the door caught a glimpse of a wide-brimmed hat in the twilight. Caleb, leaning against the hitch rail, arms crossed, unmoving. He hadn't come in, but he hadn't left either. Inside the chapel, the town sang hymns in harmony. Outside, one man stood still in the dust, watching what everyone else refused to see. The Reverend Silas Coates stood tall behind the pulpit, his hands pressed firm to the sides of his leather-bound Bible. He preached with fire in his chest and a smile sharpened by discipline. To the town, he was a man of great devotion, a guiding light in a place that clung to its rituals like a ship to anchor. He had baptized every child in Bell's Hollow for the last 2 decades. He buried fathers, married daughters, and never once missed a Sunday. He also owned the girl who swept his floors. Mary Ann had lived in the back room of the Coates house since she was 14, after her parents died of fever during the bad summer. The Reverend had taken her in, out of mercy, as he often reminded her. But there was no mercy in the dark corner where she slept, just a cot without a mattress and a rusted basin where she washed in silence. The Reverend's wife, Lucille, ran the household with the severity of a prison warden. She praised Mary Ann's humility to the churchwomen, called her sweet and grateful. But at home, Lucille corrected her posture with the back of a ladle and punished slowness with salt rubbed into scraped knuckles. That night after the service, Mary Ann returned to the Coates house alone. The Reverend stayed behind for a meeting with the church board. She entered through the back door, hands still smelling of candle wax and ash. In the dim kitchen, Lucille sat stitching a hymnal cover, not looking up as she spoke. "You embarrassed us," she said, crying out in church like a dog. Marianne said nothing. "You need to learn to sit still. You need to learn pain is part of obedience." Still, Marianne said nothing. Lucille set down her needle. "Go to your room. Tomorrow you'll scrub the chapel steps before sunrise. Maybe kneeling will remind you what you're here for." Marianne climbed the creaking stairs, every step an echo of strain in her back and thighs. In the attic room, she curled against the wall, clutching her threadbare blanket, knees pulled close. Through a crack in the roof, a star blinked in the distance. She didn't pray. She didn't cry, she just stayed awake. And out past the town limits, in the glow of dying embers, Caleb Rye sat on his porch polishing a horseshoe with slow, deliberate strokes. His hands were blackened by years of ash and steel. But he paused now, and then looking south toward the chapel as if listening for something no one else could hear. The wind swept down from the mesa like a sigh too tired to speak. In the half-light of morning, Caleb Rye was already at the forge behind his cabin, coaxing flame from coal with slow, practiced rhythm. His hands, burned and calloused, moved without needing thought. He hadn't spoken in days, didn't need to. The fire knew what he meant. The clanging of hammer against iron broke the stillness, but only for a moment. As the steel took shape under his will, Caleb's mind drifted again to the girl at the chapel, the way she moved as though her own body betrayed her, the way pain shimmered just beneath her skin, like bruises beneath a Sunday dress. He had seen that kind of pain before in war, in women who showed up at the back door of the fort begging for bread and silence, in his wife one winter night, when blood and life slipped from her faster than he could hold it in, but most of all, in his daughter. Her name had been Rose. She was soft-voiced and curious, with hair like corn silk, and a habit of leaving wildflowers on his anvil. She died at 7, caught in a fever that took half the county. Caleb had buried her himself beneath the cedar tree near the pasture, and when he placed the last stone, he folded his voice into the dirt with her. He hadn't spoken more than a handful of words since. Now, nearly 15 years later, something about Marianne had stirred that grave inside him. Back in town, Marianne knelt in front of the chapel steps, scrubbing with lye water and a stiff, bristled brush. The skin on her hands was pink and swollen. Her fingers cracked and bleeding. Her dress, threadbare at the elbows, had soaked through from the knees down. Each time she adjusted her posture, she winced just slightly, but no one paused to notice. She worked alone as the town buzzed around her. Men moved barrels, women traded eggs for cloth, and children chased dogs down the street. No one offered her water. No one asked why a young woman was scrubbing stone steps on her knees before breakfast. When the Reverend Coates passed by with his hands folded behind his back, he smiled as if proud. "Obedience brings blessings, child," he said. Marianne didn't answer. She didn't lift her head, just kept scrubbing. Across the road near the hitching posts, Caleb stood silently beside his cart, one hand on the worn strap of a feed sack, the other resting against his hip. His horse huffed softly beside him, but he didn't move to tie it. He was watching her. Their eyes met just for a breath. Hers were flat exhausted, suspicious. His were unreadable. She looked away first. Inside the store, Caleb bought a length of rope and a sack of nails. The shopkeeper asked, "Building a fence, Mr. Rye?" Caleb didn't answer. He dropped 2 silver coins on the counter and left. That evening, long after the streets had emptied, Marianne sat on the floor of her attic room, arms wrapped around her legs. Her body ached with a dull, persistent fire. Her eyes stared blankly at the warped ceiling above her, where one nail hung half-driven into the beam. A spider moved silently across it. Out on his porch, Caleb stared into the flames of his cook fire. The The rope from earlier lay coiled beside him untouched. In his lap, an old hunting knife sat half-sharpened. His thumb traced the edge of it slowly, not cutting, just remembering. He remembered what it liked to be too late. He remembered silence and how it buries you with the dead. And now, for the first time in years, he felt something else, an old rusted instinct rising, the need to protect, and the fear that this town would look the other way again. The next morning, just before sunrise, the town stirred to life beneath the sky, the color of old parchment. Bell's Hollow always woke early, as if daylight alone could cleanse whatever lingered from the night before. But the air this morning carried a heaviness that even the sun could not lift. Marianne stood at the pump behind the chapel, filling a metal bucket with trembling hands. Her knuckles were wrapped in linen now, and one eye bore the faded remnant of a bruise beneath light powder. She wore the same blue dress as the day before, dried stiff and patched at the waist. Her body moved slower than usual, but her silence remained unchanged. Inside the chapel, Reverend Coates practiced his sermon, reading aloud with gentle intensity about submission and grace. He never once mentioned justice. He rarely did. As Marianne passed the main street with her bucket, Caleb stepped into her path. He had come early, too early for it to be casual, and stood near the trough as though inspecting the woodwork. When she saw him, she stiffened, almost dropping the handle. "You all right?" he asked quietly. His voice was rough, deep, rarely used. Marianne didn't look up. She kept walking, but Caleb turned to follow her just 2 steps. He didn't reach for her, he didn't press, just said, "You don't have to stay quiet." She froze. Then, without turning, she replied, barely above the sound of wind, "That's what they told the last girl." And she kept walking. Caleb stood still for a long while after that. Later that morning, he walked to the sheriff's office, boot heels echoing against the wood planks. Sheriff Myron Hensley was leaning back in his chair with a toothpick in his mouth and a rifle across his lap. He looked up unsurprised. "Well, I'll be. Caleb Rye in town twice in 2 days. Must be the end times." Caleb said nothing at first. Then, "The girl at the chapel, she's hurt." The sheriff arched an eyebrow. "Girl? You mean Marianne, the Reverend's ward? She's not fine. Is that what she told you?" "No, she didn't have to." The sheriff chewed his toothpick. "Listen, I know you've been out there on your own for years, and I respect a man who keeps to himself. But you come in here with hearsay about a preacher and his wife, people who feed that girl and give her roof without proof." He leaned forward. "You're going to find yourself the talk of town, and not in the good way." Caleb's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Sheriff Hensley sighed. "Don't poke at things you don't understand. Sometimes keeping the peace means leaving well enough alone." Caleb turned and left. By late afternoon, word had spread in whispers that Caleb Rye had taken an interest in the girl that he was meddling. That perhaps the years alone had turned his mind soft, or worse. Inside the Coates' home, Marianne stood at the window with her hands pressed to the frame. She had seen Caleb speaking to the sheriff. She didn't know why that mattered, but somehow it did. That night, when the house grew quiet and the oil lamps were blown out, Marianne did not sleep. She lay still in the dark and whispered a single sentence into the void. "Please don't stop noticing." The scent of iron and oil still lingered in Caleb Rye's clothes as he stood beside the corral, staring past the hills with a posture carved in stone. He hadn't eaten since the day before. Hunger didn't visit him often. Not the kind that came from food, anyway. Inside his barn, hanging by the door, was a satchel he hadn't touched in years, one that once held his daughter's hair ribbons and the wooden horse he'd carved for her on her 6th birthday. That satchel would travel with him again, but not today. He kept hearing her voice, Marianne's voice, low, dry, honest. That's what they told the last girl. It hadn't been said for pity. It was a confession, a quiet plea wrapped in warning. He walked to his anvil and lit the forge. Not to work, but to think. Flames helped him think. Fire didn't lie. It either took or didn't. Across town, Marianne stood barefoot in the dirt yard behind the Coates' home, hanging laundry in the full glare of midday. The lines trembled in the dry air, dresses and aprons swaying like ghostly arms. Behind her, the back door creaked open. "Still got enough strength to lift linens," came Lucille Coates' voice. "Then I suppose your back ain't broken?" Marianne didn't reply. She just reached for another sheet. "You think because some blacksmith raised his eyebrows, the world's gonna shift?" Lucille stepped forward now, voice lower. "Let me tell you something, girl. Men like Caleb Rye come sniffing around when they want something broken to fix. You think he sees you? He sees a burden." Marianne turned slightly. Her voice was quiet, but it no longer trembled. Better to be a burden than a ghost. Lucille slapped her hard across the mouth. No warning, no pause, just the sound of palm against skin, and a pause so thick it could break. Marianne didn't fall. She didn't run. She just stepped back one pace, wiped her lip with the back of her hand, and returned to the sheet. Lucille said nothing more. Caleb came into town that evening, not on horseback, but on foot. He walked the long road slow and deliberate, not speaking to anyone, not looking into faces. He passed the saloon, the post office, the barber shop. Every man on the boardwalk noticed. So did every woman behind curtains. He went straight to the chapel. The front doors were open, light pouring out across the steps Marianne had scrubbed. Inside, Reverend Coates stood adjusting hymnals for the next day's sermon. His face brightened with a counterfeit smile when he saw Caleb. "Brother Rye," he said, "a rare honor. Have you come seeking prayer?" Caleb stepped forward, stopping just 1 foot from the pulpit. "No." The smile faded. "Then, what brings you to God's house at this hour?" Caleb looked around slowly. "She shouldn't be under your roof." The Reverend stiffened. "I beg your pardon? You don't feed her. You don't shelter her. You keep her as penance, like a dog that flinches when you raise your hand. Now see here. I see enough." The silence that followed was thick and blistering. Coates adjusted his collar. "You're treading dangerous ground, son." Caleb stepped back toward the exit. "I buried my daughter under a cedar tree on Ridgeback Hill. She never once flinched when I raised my voice. That's how I know what love isn't." And with that, he left the chapel. He didn't see the figure hiding just inside the vestibule. Marianne, her body pressed flat against the inner wall. Fists clenched at her sides, her breath unsteady. For the first time in 5 years, someone had said out loud what she had only dared to think, and it echoed inside her like thunder that promised rain. It was nearly midnight when Marianne packed the box. She did it slowly, not because of hesitation, but because every bone in her body ached like they remembered too much. In the dim attic light, she wrapped her shawl around a small tin of ointment, the kind she used when the bruises ran too deep for fabric to hide. She added a sewing needle, a Bible with pages worn soft at Psalm 71, and a faded photograph of her parents, creased in the middle where she'd folded it too many times to count. No shoes, just a scarf, a handful of coins, and a single hairbrush with broken teeth. She closed the box, tied it with twine, and crept down the stairs barefoot, careful not to let the wood groan beneath her. In the parlor, Lucille lay snoring in her rocker mouth, slack a whiskey glass at her feet. The Reverend wasn't home off on one of his council calls, though Marianne knew better. He often returned after midnight, smelling of pipe smoke and rose perfume, muttering scriptures no one had asked for. At the door, she paused. Then she bent, placed the box down carefully on the threshold, and tucked a folded note beneath the twine. Her handwriting was small and steady. "If anything happens to me, please give this to the man who noticed." She didn't sign it. She didn't have to. and then she slipped out into the dark. Outside town, clouds rolled over the moon like secrets too heavy to hold. Caleb sat by his forge, sharpening the last of his blades. The sound of steel on stone was steady, one stroke after another, not rushed, not idle. He was not a man who waited for signs, but something in him stirred like a mule sensing a storm. When he heard the knock, it wasn't loud. Just 2 taps. Hesitant. He opened the door and found her there. Marianne, soaked from the mist hair clinging to her face, dress wrinkled and torn at the hem. Her eyes weren't crying, but they held the look of someone who used to. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Caleb stepped aside without a word. Inside, he placed a blanket around her shoulders and poured warm water into a basin. She didn't resist when he took her hand and checked her wrists. Didn't flinch when he handed her a cup of broth. Didn't speak again that night, not until the fire burned low and the silence between them felt less like distance and more like shelter. "I left everything," she said. "Good," he replied. She looked at him. "That's all you'll say?" Caleb met her gaze. "Sometimes leaving is louder than shouting." She smiled, but only a little. Then she leaned her head against the armrest of the chair and closed her eyes, not to sleep but to rest in a room where no one asked anything of her. In the early light of the next morning, the Reverend stood at his doorstep in his long coat, staring at the box by the door. He saw the twine, the handwriting, the emptiness of the hallway behind him. Lucille stepped out behind him, hairpin tight. "She's gone." Coates didn't speak, just picked up the box and turned toward the road. "You think it was that blacksmith?" she asked. He paused. "I think it's time the town remembered who built this church." His tone was calm, too calm. Lucille narrowed her eyes. "You gonna make a sermon of it?" He looked ahead, voice like stone. "No, I'm going to make an example." The road out of Bell's Hollow twisted between dry gullies and brittle cottonwoods, silent under the weight of things left unsaid. Marianne sat on the edge of Caleb's porch, wrapped in his old army coat, staring at the sky like it might answer her. She hadn't asked for anything, not food, not protection, not sympathy, and Caleb hadn't offered words. He brought her coffee that morning, strong and bitter, and nodded once when she thanked him. That was enough. Inside the cabin, the table was bare, except for the small box Marianne had carried in her arms, the one she'd taken back before dawn, when she realized she couldn't leave it behind. Caleb hadn't asked what was in it. He never asked things that didn't matter. Around midday, the sound of hooves rose in the distance, slow, deliberate. Caleb stepped out to meet it. Marianne stayed seated, tense but still. The sheriff rode up with dust on his boots and suspicion in his eyes. "Morning," he said. "Heard you had company." Caleb said nothing. The sheriff nodded toward the porch. "Word is she walked out on the Reverend's house. You aware that girl's under church care? She's not property." "No," the sheriff agreed. "But in this town, reputation is currency, and Reverend Coates don't like folks stealing his." Caleb crossed his arms. "He ain't owed a thing he didn't earn," the sheriff sighed. "Look, Caleb, just bring her back. Let this quiet down." Caleb didn't blink. "She stays." Marianne stood slowly, voice steady. "I'm not a fugitive?" The sheriff looked at her, really looked, and something shifted in his expression. He saw the faint swelling along her jaw, the thin scars along her wrists, signs he hadn't wanted to see before. He adjusted the reins. "Fine, but I'll tell you both now. Coates won't take this lying down." And with that, he rode off. That evening, as the sky dimmed to copper, Caleb hitched up his mule and cart. Marianne stood beside the barn, confused. "You're leaving?" He shook his head. "We are. I don't want to run. Not running. We're moving forward." She hesitated, then climbed onto the bench beside him. They didn't say another word for miles. As they passed the outer edge of town, Caleb reached into his coat pocket and handed her something small, a folded scrap of paper. She opened it. It was a map, hand-drawn rough, marking a trail toward Dry Creek Ridge. "Safe house?" she asked. "No, just space. I got friends near the canyon, old army folk. Nobody asks questions there." She folded the paper again and tucked it into her dress. Behind them, the town was growing darker, and inside the chapel, Reverend Coates lit a candle and spoke aloud to no one. "I warned her," he muttered, then louder to the shadows. "They think they're safe. But every soul in this town still answers to God." He placed Marianne's box on the altar and smiled. The sun had not yet touched the horizon when the church bell rang, not for prayer but for judgment. Reverend Coates stood at the front steps of the chapel in full Sunday attire, though it was only Wednesday. His coat was pressed, his collar starched, his voice rehearsed. Townsfolk began to gather, uncertain but obedient. The Reverend rarely summoned them without warning, and never on a workday. That alone made them nervous. Inside the chapel, Marianne's box sat atop the pulpit like a relic waiting to be blessed or burned. Lucille stood at her husband's side, chin high, arms folded like a statue. She hadn't spoken a word to anyone since Marianne disappeared, but now her presence was louder than any testimony. Coates raised his hand. The murmurs fell quiet. "My flock," he said. "We find ourselves in a moment of great trial." He gestured toward the box. "This girl, this lost, misguided soul, was taken in by this church. We clothed her, we fed her, and in return she has turned her back on the word. She consorts now with a man who does not kneel in prayer, who does not pay tithe, who does not fear judgment." He let the words hang, then softer. "But the Lord sees, and the Lord delivers." That same morning, beyond the ridge, Caleb and Marianne reached an old homestead nestled between cottonwoods and sandstone. It wasn't much, just a frame house, half-rotted, a small spring, and a rickety barn. But it was far, and it was quiet. Caleb set down the supplies while Marianne explored the edge of the property. She moved slower now, but lighter, like the air itself weighed less here. "I could fix the shutters," she said. Caleb nodded. "We'll need them before the rains. Rains don't come until summer." He looked at her then. "Planning to stay that long?" Marianne didn't answer, but her smile said enough. Back in Bell's Hollow, the sheriff paced the steps of his office, uneasy. The townspeople had left the chapel murmuring about sin, reputation, and the blacksmith who corrupted the girl. But there were doubts now, splinters of uncertainty in the eyes of the women especially. Sheriff Hensley took one more look toward the church, then mounted his horse. He didn't ride toward the chapel, he rode toward Ridgeback. At the canyon edge, the wind shifted. A hawk passed overhead. Caleb sensed the change before the hooves were audible. When the sheriff rode up, Marianne stood from the porch. She didn't run. Hensley dismounted slowly, hands raised. "Ain't here for trouble?" Caleb stood behind her, silent. The sheriff looked at them both, then reached inside his coat. For a second, Caleb tensed, but what emerged wasn't a weapon. It was a letter, folded once stained at the corner. "Found this at the telegraph office," the sheriff said. "It's from a girl who used to work in Coates' house before Marianne sent from a sanatorium up in Abilene." He handed it to her. Marianne opened it with shaking fingers. "If someone still listens, I was not the first. Please believe her." She stared at the paper, then at Caleb, then back at the sheriff. "What do I do with this?" she asked. The sheriff cleared his throat. "You come back. You tell them." Marianne shook her head. "They won't believe me." The sheriff met her eyes. "Maybe not, but I will." By the time Marianne stepped back into Bell's Hollow, the streets had gone quiet in that tense, watchful way. Like when animals sense a storm, no one else sees coming. She walked beside the sheriff with her chin high, but her hands trembled slightly beneath the folded letter she clutched to her chest. Caleb didn't follow. He stayed behind at her request, knowing this part wasn't his to fight. She hadn't come to be defended. She had come to be heard. A few women paused at their porches as she passed. One of them, Sister Darlene the First, who'd ignored her words weeks ago, lowered her eyes. At the chapel, Reverend Coates stood on the steps again, as if he hadn't moved since the last gathering. But his expression faltered when he saw the sheriff escorting Marianne directly toward him. "What is this?" he said, voice sharp. The sheriff ignored him and opened the chapel doors wide. "We're holding testimony, right here, right now." People began to gather again. Word spread faster than fire in dry brush. By noon, the pews were filled with familiar faces, some curious, some skeptical, some hollow with regret. Marianne stepped up to the pulpit slowly. Her footsteps echoed louder than any sermon Coates had ever given. She didn't speak right away, just unfolded the letter and held it up for all to see. "This is from a girl who lived in the Reverend's house before me," she read aloud. The words shook the air like a church bell cracked in half. "He prayed with us at night and then came into our rooms when his wife fell asleep. He told us it was the Lord's way of testing purity." Gasps broke out across the pews. Marianne lowered the paper and met the eyes of those who had seen her bruises and said nothing. "I said it hurt to sit." She waited, and you all looked away. There was no fire in her voice, only quiet truth. That made it burn deeper. Coates stepped forward, face red. "This is blasphemy. I have served this town, this congregation." The sheriff blocked his path. "Sit down, Silas." Lucille Coates stood in the back, frozen. A single tear rolled down her cheek, not for her husband, but for herself. Marianne looked out over the congregation. "I'm not here to punish anyone. I'm here to ask something harder. I'm asking you not to forget. Not again." She stepped down. The silence was deafening. Then one by one, a few women stood. Sister Darlene, a young widow named Clara, even Lucille. None spoke. But they stood. Outside, Caleb waited beside his cart arms, crossed eyes fixed on the chapel doors. When they opened and Marianne stepped out, she wasn't crying. She wasn't smiling either. She just walked straight to him. "They stood," she said simply. He nodded. "Good." Behind her, the bell rang again. But this time not by the Reverend's hand. It rang for truth. Spring crept into Bell's Hollow that year like an apology. The chapel remained open, but the pews sat emptier than before. Reverend Coates had vanished by the end of the week. No service, no sermon, no goodbye, just a note left on his desk and a silence the congregation didn't dare question. Lucille closed the house and left town within days, her face hidden beneath a travel veil. In her place, Sister Darlene took up the altar work, sweeping the steps Marianne had once scrubbed on bleeding knees. No one said it out loud, but they all knew. Something old had been broken, and something new had started. Caleb had offered Marianne the cabin outright, even cleared out the loft where old army gear gathered dust. But she didn't accept. "I'm not ready to rest yet," she'd said. "I want to build something, not just hide in something made for someone else." So together they rebuilt the homestead near Dry Creek Ridge. Caleb hammered the beams. Marianne laid the foundation stone. She planted herbs out back and patched her dresses with scraps of blue linen. On market days, she rode into town on her own horse. Not once did she look at the chapel. She didn't need to. A few months later, during the summer fair, townsfolk gathered around the square as was tradition. Children tugged at corn cakes, fiddlers played old waltzes, men traded tools and talk, and then they saw her, Marianne, stepping from her wagon dress, clean face calm. She held a basket of hand-stitched goods and placed them at a stall beside the blacksmith's. No one dared ignore her now.